What if you received a call from someone who disappeared years ago? The voice on the line is familiar, but it sounds distant, almost spectral. It asks you to go to an isolated place. Would you answer that call? If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tell us about your stories and where you're watching from. The phone rang at an hour when no call should be expected, long past midnight, when the world slumbers in uneasy silence. André, weary from another night of drowning his solitude in half-finished glasses of whiskey, stared at the glowing screen. The number was unfamiliar, yet something in his bones, in the marrow of his very being, recognized it. A tremor ran through his fingers as he answered. "André." The voice was soft, brittle, like the whisper of wind through the cracks of an old abandoned house. It was a voice he had not heard in 5 years, a voice that should not exist. "Helena?" he rasped, his throat tightening, a breath on the line. Static, distant as if the words traveled from a place far beyond reach. "Come to the station, please, I can't leave, I can't." The call cut off. The silence that followed was heavier than the voice itself. André sat motionless, the phone still, pressed to his ear, as if hoping the dead air would whisper her voice once more. It did not. Instead, a slow horror seeped into him like ink spilled into water. Helena had vanished 5 years ago. No body was ever found. No trace, no leads. Just a woman who walked into the evening fog and was never seen again. And now, after all these years, her voice had returned. His hand tightened around the phone. The number, it was hers. Her old number. But that was impossible. That phone had been disconnected, deactivated, buried in the past along with her absence. The whiskey in his veins should have dulled his senses, should have made him question himself, but instead, the opposite occurred. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to go. He grabbed his coat. Outside, the city was asleep. Streetlights flickered, barely holding back the darkness. As André drove, the road stretched before him like a hollow vein, leading him toward something unknown. The station was old, abandoned for decades, sitting on the outskirts like a forgotten relic of another time. He had not been there since. He shook the thought away. The car's headlights cut through the thickening mist as he arrived. The iron gate stood ajar, rusted but waiting as though they had been expecting him. As he stepped inside, a shiver crept up his spine. The night air was heavy, dense with an unnatural silence. The scent of damp wood and rust lingered. And then he heard it. A voice. Many voices. Whispering. Calling. Not just Helena's. André turned, his head sharply toward the empty platforms, toward the hollow train cars lined up like corpses. And that's when he saw them. Dozens of figures, standing in the darkness, watching, waiting, and just before the chapter ends, Helena stepped forward from their midst, her face pale as death itself. "You came," she whispered. "Now you must stay." André's breath hitched in his throat. His pulse pounded in his ears like the distant rumble of an oncoming train. The figures stood motionless, silhouetted by the dim glow of the flickering station lamps. Their faces were obscured, swallowed by the shadows, but their presence was undeniable, an oppressive weight pressing against the air itself. But it was her that held him captive. Helena. She looked just as she had the night she disappeared, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her dress swaying gently as though moved by a wind he could not feel. But there was something wrong. Her eyes. They were hollow, distant, as if staring through him rather than at him. "Helena?" His voice cracked. She did not move at first, merely watching him with that vacant expression. And then, slowly, she lifted her hand. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. André took a step forward, but his foot hit the wooden platform with a hollow thud. Something about the sound unsettled him. It was too distant, as though it had traveled through layers of reality before reaching his ears. "You called me," he managed, his throat dry. You said you couldn't leave. Helena, what the hell is going on? A murmur rose from the figures behind her. Low, indistinct. It slithered through the air, brushing against his skin like fingers tracing his spine. Then, they moved. Not all at once, but in small unnatural shifts like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Some turned their heads toward him in a series of jerky, unnatural motions. Others merely took a step forward, their shoes scuffing against the old platform wood. André's gut screamed at him to run. André. Helena's voice cut through the whispers. Listen to me. You have to. A sharp, metallic screech interrupted her. The sound sent a shudder through his very bones. It was the unmistakable shriek of a train's brakes, but there was no train in sight. And yet, the ground beneath him trembled. The station lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the empty rails. A gust of wind surged through the platform, and for the briefest moment he could hear it, the deep, guttural churning of an approaching locomotive. Except it wasn't coming down the tracks. It was coming from the darkness behind the figures. The murmur among them grew louder, urgent. A single voice rose above the others, raspy, desperate. He doesn't belong here. He doesn't belong. Then, as though something unseen had shifted, every single figure turned toward him in unison. André's breath faltered. A woman in the front. A young girl no older than 16, her dress tattered and stained, took a trembling step forward. Her voice was barely above a whisper. If you leave now, it will come for you. And then, the station clock struck midnight. A deafening chime echoed through the empty halls, reverberating inside André's skull. The world lurched beneath him. The figures began to close in. Helena reached for him, but just as her fingers brushed his wrist, the station collapsed into darkness. André's breath came in ragged gasps as the world snapped into darkness. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no air, just an abyss stretching in all directions. Then, the lights flickered back on. But something had changed. The air felt thicker, charged with a stillness that made his skin crawl. The scent of damp wood had soured, tainted by something metallic, iron, blood. The platform remained beneath his feet, but the world beyond it had shifted. The once abandoned station was no longer empty. The waiting benches, the rusted ticket booths, they were all occupied. Figures sat motionless, their backs rigid, their heads hanging forward as though in restless sleep. Their clothes were torn, aged, some in fashions that hadn't been worn for decades. A train, black as the void, stood silently on the tracks. Its doors were open, inviting. André's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. No, he muttered. No, no, no. A hand clutched his wrist. He twisted violently, his body coiling in terror, until he saw her, Helena. But this time, her expression was urgent. Terrified. You have to listen to me, she hissed, her grip cold against his skin. You're standing on the edge, André. You can't stay here. If you stay too long... A voice, not Helena's. All passengers, board the train. The announcement did not come from the speakers. It rippled through the air itself, vibrating through André's bones like a foreign presence had crawled beneath his skin. He turned toward the sound, and froze. At the center of the platform, a conductor stood, or at least something that resembled one. His uniform was immaculate, but his skin was wrong. Ashen, stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones. His lips did not move as he repeated, "All passengers, board the train." The seated figures stirred. One by one, their heads lifted. André's blood ran cold. Their eyes were hollow, not empty, hollow. Gaping voids of pure blackness stared back at him, deep enough to swallow the world. They rose, every one of them. Moving in unnatural unison, they turned toward the waiting train. Their steps were too light, as if the floor barely held them. "We have to go." Helena yanked his arm, but André couldn't move, because just then, from somewhere deep within the black train, he heard it. A sound, faint at first, like distant breathing. Then deeper, closer, a grotesque, guttural croaking, like the sound of something vast and unnatural waking from a deep slumber. Something was inside the train, waiting. And as the first of the hollow-eyed figures stepped inside, the noise became laughter, a wet, choking laugh that made André's stomach lurch. Then, Helena screamed. A force ripped her from his grasp, dragging her toward the open doors. Her nails scraped against the floor, her body convulsing as she tried to resist. "André!" He lunged for her, but just as his fingers brushed hers, the doors slammed shut. The train let out a deep, piercing whistle. The conductor turned, his hollow eyes locking onto André, and with a slow, unnatural smile, he lifted his pocket watch and clicked it shut. The station collapsed into darkness once more. There was no time to think. André stumbled forward as the train lurched to life, its wheels shrieking against the rusted rails. The air trembled, thick with the scent of burning metal and something fouler, something wrong. "Helena!" he roared, slamming his fists against the sealed doors. His own voice felt small against the vast, suffocating night. Through the grimy window he saw them, the passengers. They sat motionless in the dim carriage, their heads hanging forward, their bodies unnaturally still. And yet he could feel them watching. Their hollow eyes, unseen yet omnipresent, locked onto him from the depths of the darkened train. And Helena, she was among them. Her lips parted as though she were screaming, but no sound escaped. Her body twitched, fighting against something André could not see. Then, she lifted her hand, a single trembling motion. Fingers barely brushing the glass, reaching for him, a plea, a warning. And just before the train could vanish into the endless fog, she mouthed something. One word, "Run." Then the world shattered. A force ripped through the station like a shockwave bursting from the train itself. The ground beneath André cracked, no, split, like fragile glass under pressure. And then, the platform was gone. André fell through the void. He hit the ground hard. But it wasn't the station floor, it was something else. Something soft, damp, moving. He rolled onto his back, gasping. The air was thick, humid, pressing into his lungs like hands dragging him underwater. A sky stretched above him, but it was wrong, swirling with black clouds that moved too fast as if time itself had fractured. He pushed himself up, his palms sinking slightly into the ground. Not dirt, not stone, flesh. The realization struck him like a hammer to the ribs. He was standing on something alive. A deep guttural vibration rippled beneath his feet. The land itself breathed. A sound broke through the thick air, a whistle. Low, ominous, close. André turned sharply. The train was here, but it was not the train from the station. This one was twisted, warped. Its black metal frame pulsed like veins beneath the skin. Its windows were not glass but gaping mouths, opening and closing as if tasting the air. The wheels dug into the living earth, leaving behind trails of bleeding flesh. The door creaked open, and someone stepped out. Not Helena, not the passengers. Something else. Its form was shifting, flickering between shapes, human and inhuman, familiar and grotesque. It wore the conductor's uniform, but the body inside it was fluid, warping like shadows cast by dying light. Its face, if it had one, was unreadable, a void, a distortion, and then it spoke. "You should not be here." The air grew heavy. André's body felt wrong, his limbs too slow, his mind drowning in a tide of unnatural sleep. The creature took a step forward. "You have seen too much." Another step. "And now you must take your seat." André tried to move, to run, but the world was closing in. The ground shifted beneath him. Hands rose from the living earth, grasping at his ankles. A sharp, piercing whistle rang through the air, and the creature, the conductor, reached for him. A final thought screamed through his mind before the darkness swallowed him. This was never a station. This was never a train. This was something else entirely. André plunged into darkness, not the kind that comes with the absence of light. This was deeper, heavier, a blackness that pressed against his skin, his bones, his mind. The sensation of falling never stopped. Then, suddenly, the world snapped back. He was seated. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, the cold bite of something long forgotten. André blinked, his vision adjusting to the dim glow of flickering lamps. The space around him was narrow, confining, a train carriage, not the monstrous, pulsing abomination he had seen before. This was pristine. Polished floors, neatly arranged seats, windows lined with thick velvet curtains. An old train, the kind that belonged to another era, untouched by time. Yet something was wrong. He turned his head slowly. Rows of passengers sat beside him, rigid, silent, lifeless. Their clothes varied, some modern, some so archaic they could have belonged to another century. And their faces, not blank, not grotesque. No, that would have been merciful. They looked normal, perfectly normal. But their eyes, black voids, empty pits that swallowed everything, watched him. André's breath hitched. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had to get out. He gripped the armrests, forcing his body to move. A hand clamped onto his wrist, cold, familiar. "Don't." The whisper sent a violent shudder through him. He turned sharply. Helena. She sat beside him, her hand gripping his wrist with unnatural strength. But it wasn't just her. She looked exactly the same. And yet the air around her felt wrong. "What is this?" André's voice came out hoarse. "What's happening to me?" Helena's grip tightened. "You didn't listen." Her voice was strained, like something else was speaking through her. "I told you to run." A deep, resonant chime rang through the carriage. André's body seized. The train lurched, moving faster now, its wheels shrieking against the unseen tracks. The outside world was gone, swallowed by a swirling abyss of shifting darkness. The conductor appeared at the far end of the carriage, his form flickered, distorted. He raised a gloved hand, and slowly, mechanically, pointed at André. The air shook. André screamed as something ripped through his mind, memories fracturing like glass. Not just his memories, himself. He saw flashes of faces, people stepping onto the train before him, their terror, their struggle, their defeat, and he saw himself, sitting there among them, a passenger, always a passenger. The truth descended upon him like a crushing weight. He hadn't been trying to escape. He had been trying to remember, because he had been here before. He had always been here. This was not a nightmare, not a trap, not a cruel twist of fate. This was his place, and he would ride the train forever. The chime rang one last time. André closed his eyes, and the train moved forward, disappearing into the void where the lost await. If you found a diary describing exactly what was going to happen to you tomorrow, would you read it to the end? What if the last page described your own death, scheduled for the next 24 hours? If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to bring more and more terrifying stories. The house stood at the edge of solitude, nestled among gnarled trees whose limbs clawed at the sky like the fingers of forgotten corpses. Lara Mendes had not chosen the house. It had chosen her. A relic from a forgotten time, its walls whispered with the voices of the past. And yet she convinced herself it was nothing more than the mutterings of an old structure surrendering to age. Dust hung in the air as she ascended the attic stairs, the wooden steps groaning beneath her weight, protesting her intrusion. There, amid the neglected remnants of another life, she found it. A small leather-bound book resting atop an ancient wooden chest. Its cover was dark, almost black, marred with time and use. No title, no inscription, just the weight of something, unspoken, pressed into its spine. With careful fingers, she lifted the book and opened it. Her breath caught in her throat. The ink was fresh, the handwriting precise. The words, etched in elegant strokes, described her morning's events in eerie detail. The burnt toast, the overturned cup of coffee, even the phone call from her mother, whose voice still echoed in her mind. Her heart pounded against her ribs. A trick, she told herself, a leftover journal from a previous owner with uncanny similarities to her own routine. Yet as she turned the pages, the inked lines stretched further, describing actions she had not yet taken, conversations yet to be had, moments yet to unfold. A shiver crawled along her spine. Then she reached the final pages, a single entry standing alone like a tombstone in a forgotten graveyard. The last days of Lara Mendez. Her breath turned shallow. The date scrawled below was tomorrow. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a slow, deliberate creak from the floorboards below. She wasn't alone. Lara's pulse pounded in her ears. The house had been silent all evening, and yet now, at this precise moment, the floorboards below betrayed movement. She held the diary tighter, as if its mere presence anchored her to reality. With careful steps, she descended the attic ladder, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. The dim light from the hallway flickered, casting shifting shadows along the corridor. Her breath quickened. The creak came again, closer. She reached the living room, her eyes darting toward the front door. Locked. The windows shut. Then, a soft rasping sound. Her gaze snapped to the coffee table where the diary now rested, though she had not placed it there. A fresh entry had appeared. She lifted the book with trembling hands, reading the new passage. She moves through the dim corridors, searching for the source of an unseen presence. But it is not the house that breathes. It is the thing that watches from the dark. The ink glistened as if freshly written. Lara stumbled backward. No, this was impossible. Her own name had appeared in its pages, but she had not written a single word. The lights flickered again, then died completely. And in the oppressive silence that followed, she heard it. A whisper. She couldn't move. The whisper came again, closer this time, like a breath against her ear. Cold fingers of terror wrapped around her spine. Lara reached blindly for her phone, its screen a dull glow in the darkness. The flashlight flickered to life, cutting through the heavy blackness. The beam landed on the mirror across the room, and something was there. A shadow taller than a man, unmoving yet radiating presence. The instant her eyes met its form, the diary's pages fluttered violently, as if caught in a phantom wind. Then, silence. The shadow was gone. The diary lay still, and Lara, gasping for breath, forced herself to move. She grabbed her coat and keys, ready to flee, but as she reached for the door, the diary was in her hands again. Panic gave way to determination. If she couldn't escape it, she would uncover its secrets. She needed answers. The name, Elias Montenegro, surfaced in her frantic research. A former owner of the house, now locked away in a psychiatric ward. Desperate, she found his location and drove through the night, the diary wrapped in cloth on the passenger seat. Elias's room was sparse, save for the scratched words covering the walls. "It knows you, it writes you know one escape." His eyes locked onto hers the moment she stepped in. "You read it, didn't you?" His voice was brittle, edged with terror. "You turned the pages, now it's yours." Lara hesitated, gripping the diary. "How do I stop it?" He shook his head. "You don't. You pass it on." The words chilled her, but before she could demand more answers, Elias lunged at her, grabbing the diary with frenzied hands. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The lights flickered, then Elias collapsed. Lara stepped back, horrified, and when she looked down at the diary, his name had been written in it. Elias had taken her place. The diary had claimed him instead. Lara watched as the ink settled into the pages, forming his fate. His last moments described in chilling detail. He twitched violently on the ground, mouth forming silent words, and then stillness. The pages turned blank. Lara fled the hospital, tossing the diary onto the back seat of a stranger's car. She drove until exhaustion overtook her, until the weight of the past days finally crushed her. For the first time since she had opened that cursed book, she felt free. The sun rose, golden and warm. Relief flooded her chest. It was over. Then her phone buzzed. A new message, from an unknown number. A single sentence chilled her blood. You cannot run from what has already been written. But remember, some stories don't end when you close the book. What would you do if you found a diary that foretold your own death? Would you dare to keep reading? Or would you try to escape the inescapable? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Who knows? The next story might be about you.